Before I roll the tutorial, I have a proposition for you. If you create a character with this tutorial and create an animation longer than 5 seconds, email it to me at this address, and I will gift you 3 entire months, 100% free, to my Patreon. This tutorial is my magnum opus, and my goal is always to make sure you create more than you consume. Enjoy. Oh, sorry, I had some, like, congestion or something. Anyways, though, anime is hard. I know we've all had experiences with that art teacher who bans anime in the classroom, and it's frustrating, sure, but their heart is usually in the right place. Because the best anime art doesn't come from studying anime, it comes from learning the fundamentals of art and then applying the anime style over them. And 3D is no exception. Without first laying a foundation of knowledge and skill, just like 2D drawing, your artwork will fall apart. As per usual, these videos are toolboxes. I'll be showing you everything you need to know from reference to modeling all the way to compositing. And I'll be directing you to some fantastic resources that really engage your brain and get you comfortable with the technology, because that's what matters most here. As per usual, links in the description for everything I cover, and the Tedo model I create here and all other files I make are on my Patreon. Let's get into it. First off, if you're using 3D software because 2D animation is scary or tedious, I'd advise you to reconsider while you're ahead. As I've prefaced, anime is complicated, and in the time it'll take to learn how to approach it in 3D, you'll be able to build up a solid 2D foundation. It's important to follow what your heart is truly in. First thing we need to do is establish a baseline. Anime is a much more nebulous term than you'd expect. What brand of anime you choose to embody can be arguably more important than how you execute it. So to do that, we're going to use this handy-dandy little graphic I like to call the Guilty Gear to Lupin III spectrum. Guilty Gear and everything by Arc System Works looks like a 2D anime. At times, these 3D models can look almost indistinguishable from a 2D drawing. However, on a technical level, it requires an insane level of execution. In the less curated Guilty Gear story mode, you can notice these snapping artifacts as the models are viewed from angles that they aren't normally meant to be viewed from in normal play. It can be off-putting and snap the viewer out of the experience. If you want to be one-to-one with 2D anime, be prepared to limit yourself a lot. It's a difficult path that requires a lot of dedicated skill, but there is glory to be found here, and if you're a 2D animator who wants to save time with 3D assets, this is the play. It's very difficult, but it's a very fruitful road. In the middle, we have this game Zenless Zone Zero. Because it's a hack-and-slash gacha game, models can be viewed from pretty much any angle you choose, so the look has to be a bit less deliberate. It's more visibly 3D, but it maintains a lot of what makes anime special, using these hand-painted textures, solid topology, and some very light normal editing. 2D graphics still feel at home here while playing to the strengths of 3D. It really is the best of both worlds. Not convincingly 2D, but clearly still anime. And finally, we have Lupin III. No edited normals, photoreal environments, standard Pixar workflow with big bendy looking anime characters. It is visibly 3D at first glance, and 2D assets would look out of place. It's the furthest one can go from that classic anime look while still bearing resemblance to traditional anime. From what I've gathered, pretty much every art style falls somewhere on this spectrum. So for this video, I will be offering approaches for people who desire the Guilty Gear look, the Zenless look, as well as occasionally mentioning Lupin. I will also be putting some emphasis on Genshin Impact, as much like Zenless, it falls in a nice middle ground between 2D and 3D that I think is worth talking about. As long as you understand what makes these styles special, you can start building your own from their bones. Sometimes the bodies are cel-shaded and then everything else is just normal textures. Sometimes the shading is left a little shitty and then drawn over. Arcane just composites the light in. Do what you find is fun and you'll pop off. Once you have an idea of what you want your world to look like, take an educated guess and put it somewhere on this spectrum. For every segment, I will have this spectrum in the corner, and I will subjectively place the technique I'm explaining somewhere on here so you can understand where it is in relation to what you're doing. Once you have that, all the mental stuff is out of the way. It's time to draw a character reference. I want to place so much emphasis on this stage as it will drive the rest of your workflow. The upside of 3D is that we can have as much detail as we want forever. Look at Jotaro here with his crazy-ass stylized design. This is what 3D is for. It's important to not over-design your character, obviously, but the ceiling for design here is way higher than traditional 2D animation. Play to your strengths and make the character as you would like to see them, as the concept of line economy does not apply to us. If you're not into 2D art, there's no shame in drawing over an anime base or just modeling someone else's character. You can figure out the details later, but poor proportions on a human body can cause issues later. When drawing the side profile, make sure to extend the lines from your front view so you can ensure that proportions remain relatively the same. And of course, for the side profile, there is no need to draw a foreshortened arm. Do not do that to yourself, and if you do, please tag me in it on Twitter. For the rest of the video, I'll be just modeling Teto, so my 2D art mistakes don't end up getting in the way of the 3D knowledge. Now that we have this colored in as you'd like, and it's time to model. This applies to just about every category here, but if you ever get stuck, Genshin, Honkai, and Zenless models are available for free online provided by Hoyo. They say these models are public for MMD reasons, but I have trouble believing that. Implications aside, these are great resources for modelers, so download them and have them on standby for when you get confused. And if you're taking the Guilty Gear approach, join the Arcsys Animators Discord. It's full of awesome rigged models by people who know what they're doing and are ready to answer any questions you have at a moment's notice. I'll cover face modeling in just a second, but first let's talk about bodies. Anime bodies don't require much explanation. They follow a pretty bog-standard character modeling workflow, and if you're new to character modeling as a whole and don't know what that looks like, I will always recommend the Dicko Modeling for Animation series. It taught me everything I know, and at the end of the day, most bodies are kind of the same. Once you have a base, you can just adjust proportions, muscle, and fat deposits to your liking to make just about anyone. One thing that the Hoyoverse games often employ is texturing the clothes onto the body mesh. A big reason for this is optimization. Texturing or modeling the clothes onto the body is a lot more efficient than having 1,000 body polygons that you'll never see. The other reason for this is, well, it looks fine. These characters rarely have a need to take off their clothes, and because of how these characters are shaded, stretching textures are not an issue. Rigging one mesh just makes the job of the rigging and simulation artists way easier, and it can make your life easier too. So for any clothing that's skin tight or fits the form of the body, consider modeling it right onto your base mesh. It's a very viable option, and in my case, I didn't have much skin tight clothing, but I did choose to make these red socks just a texture instead of modeling them. Other than that, Dicko tutorial all the way, just regular old body and clothes. Now the head though, that's a whole different story. The anime face and hair define the style, and it is by far the most complicated part of this whole process, and one without a straightforward workflow, so I'll just show you how I do it. We want to take any object and delete all but a single vertex, then mirror and subdivide that vertex and start extruding it to create an outline of the head based on our reference. Then in the same manner, we'll outline our lips, the eyes, and then extrude a loop around the eyes by alt-clicking and then pressing E. Once that's all done, we switch to the side view, position the head outline around the neck area of our reference, and we use proportional editing to drag out this outline to the chin like this. Sort of like a jawline. Then from there, we'll extrude the side profile and connect our lips to the side profile like so. I've seen a common practice among anime artists where they rotate the eye sockets to fit the head like this, but there's a secret little technique for an even better side profile and 3/4 angle we can employ here. Just rotate the eye sockets a little bit, then with proportional editing enabled, pull back the outer corner of the eye and rotate it. I'll have a link to the Arcsys Powerpoint in the description that explains why they do this in depth, but in essence, we're doing this to get the eyes to look properly shaped from the front, with a bigger socket from the side, and from a 3/4 angle, the socket more realistically wraps around the head. Plus, the iris ends up laying in a more realistic position from the side, which we'll get to in a second. We'll also do the same with the lips, by taking the outer corners of the mouth and retracting them farther than usual. Normally this would cause a bit of a strange expression, but with a toon shader enabled, it instead prevents the line of the lip from getting too close to the side of the head during a 3/4 angle, and it supports that classic anime side profile smile. And now that we have all the fundamental features in place, we again arrive at a crossroads. I'll cover this more in shading, stretching, but in the Guilty Gear art style, the mouth is surrounded by this set of triangular spans. This is for 3 reasons. 1, it's easier to make big expressions when you don't have to worry about topology, warping, and stretching. 2, anime don't shade the mouth or cheekbones, so it keeps this area shaded completely flat. And 3, it lets you have as much topology on the lips you could possibly want without increasing the amount of spans in the rest of the face. That being said, unless you modify your normals like Guilty Gear, this topology looks horrendous. Games that use more default shading like Genshin keep their topology bog standard beginning to end, and then use a black and white map to determine where the light will land on the face. So it's up to you what you choose to do, and I think that's why it's so important to place your work on this spectrum, because something like Chainsaw Man does tend to shade around the lips, so inevitably you're going to have to alter some parts of your workflow to achieve what you want to achieve. If you want to be authentic to Guilty Gear, use those triangles, but otherwise you can get away with the exact same techniques with perfectly square topology. For the Hoyoverse style, simply fill in the head like you would any standard face retopology, and once again, I have a guide in the description for this. Thank you, Dicko. Then you'll extrude this eye socket and mouth hole back to make these kind of bags, then sharpen the edges by marking them sharp and pressing Shift-E and dragging your cursor outward. For the Arcsys style, you'll basically do everything you did for the Hoyo method. Fill in the eye area, connect the lips to both the nose and the chin, and then define the outer face. Then, so long as your face shape is pretty set in stone, you can just form these triangles all the way around the mouth, which if you're used to the regular 3D workflow, feels very incorrect, but I promise it'll be alright once we get to shading. Now that you have a flat alien head, it's time for features. For the eyelashes, you'll just use a flat plane and extrude it into the shape you desire, but if you want to take it further, I like to subdivide and extrude my eyelashes a bit, then use Shift-E to sharpen any areas that I want sharpened. I do the same with the eyebrows, following the reference and sticking them to the head. Then I add one more line at the top of the eyelid with a small shadow in the bottom right. Normally we would texture on a detail like this, but anime eyes bend around and warp a lot, and we don't want nasty stretching pixels around the eye, so we model it instead, just using a regular tiny little plane with no depth. For our iris, we'll just make a circle that fits the reference, and then we'll extrude it inward, extrude again, and merge at center. From here, you'll add however many spans you want, and then take the inner part of this iris and with proportional editing set to sphere, pull it inward. You can also go the Guilty Gear route of adding this little bump on the outside of the eye, but it's totally up to what you prefer. The reason we pull back the iris like this is once again to support the perspective from the side profile. From the front, we just want a normal pupil, and then from the side, we want the iris to be a bit pulled back, and the best way to do that is with some kind of concave shape. Finally, you'll rotate the iris to match the eye socket, and then position it somewhere where from a side profile, there's no white showing on this side. Keep in mind that from a side profile, this is where the eye bumps out towards the iris, so having any white here can be interpreted as a perspective error. This is why it's important to pull back the corners of your eye socket instead of rotating the whole thing, because having this flat area allows you to position the iris inside of it without any yucky white showing on the other side. Any other details that you intend on stretching a lot should be modeled in here. Often a plane is modeled into the eye to simulate this cast shadow from the eyelid. Highlights on the iris are modeled, and personally I'll be modeling in a small shadow where the lip meets the chin, as the mouth is also something that moves a lot and I don't want this chin shadow looking weird later. The final thing we'll model in is hair, which 90% of the time we do using curves. Add a Bezier circle to your scene, and then add a NURBS path, and then set the NURBS path object to the circle. And now whatever shape we make the circle will become the shape of the curve. Just use Alt-S to scale down the curve if it happens to be too big, and to form our hair shape, we'll just delete one vertex on this circle and size down each segment to create a tiny little triangle. You can adjust this to your liking depending on how spiky or soft you'd like your hair strands. Then you'll go about duplicating and adding these curves all around the head to mimic the hair. Don't worry about clipping for now, as we won't be shading this hair in a very traditional way, and I think it's important to focus on making things look pretty before you go back and fix them. Helpful shortcuts here to know are Alt-S to change the thickness of a segment, E to extrude new segments, and Control-T to twist a strand if Blender decides to face it the wrong way, which it will do very, very often. In my case, now that I have all the loose hair in the front positioned, I have to deal with the back of the head, which is tied up into these two drill hair things, so I had to come up with a bit of a weird solution. I used the Hoyo technique of modeling straight onto the body and shaded the back of the head all red, and then molded it to fit the hair. If you're using a toon shader and want to make sure everything looks alright, I'd just create a few materials that consist of nothing but a solid color and assign them around your whole head to see if your silhouettes look good. And in this case, I think they do. From there, you can either connect your head to the body, which I would recommend using loop tools to do so, or you can always just leave the head as its own separate object, as using a toon shader, most of this will probably be hidden anyway. And with that, we are done modeling. It's time to tie it all together with shading. I guess one could say I have some shading skill to share with you. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. If you're here right now, you're probably just like me, a self-teacher. Something about organized learning environments just never sat right with me, which is why I'm so happy to say I am a proud member of Skillshare. Skillshare is a learning community built by creatives for creatives, with thousands of on-demand classes for any topic you could possibly desire. This month I've been working on finding a video editing pipeline that actually suits my needs, and Gareth David's Complete Beginner's Guide to After Effects has completely changed the way I function. It's opened my eyes to the possibility of just editing an entire video in After Effects, which is now something I do. Skillshare has classes from drawing to animation to 3D work to writing, all in one place. The first 500 people to join Skillshare using the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare on me. So join up and get learning today. Before you forget, change the color transform from filmic to standard. You'll thank me later. I hope you really have a vision for what you want to do here, because this is where things get nebulous. There are two approaches to character texturing here. One is the Guilty Gear square method, and the other is the Genshin Impact painting method. For both, I'd recommend acquiring and enabling the Yuku Paint add-on so you have more than just one layer to work with. A classic round brush will do here if you're an alpha like that, but if you want, you can always acquire more brushes to suit your needs. I have some free brushes linked below. One little thing to mention for all styles is that you can either cut out or extrude this little shape onto your character's nose and color it black. Anime characters often have this little line weight detail around the nose to define the side profile, and it gives a more clear visual to where the nose is from the front. For the Arcsys style, shading is quite complicated. Arcsys needs their models to hold up graphically, not just from afar, but also right up close, and in this case, an image texture usually doesn't cut it, as without a crazy resolution, it starts pixelating up close. Luckily, there is a secret method we can use to alleviate all that. If a texture is drawn perfectly 90 degrees along a UV seam, it doesn't need to stretch at all, so it acts kind of like vector art and is perfectly sharp from all distances. To do this on a whole character, we separate every part of the character that is a different color using UV seams, unwrap the character, square the UV islands, place them in their respective color area, and then slowly drag the map into the black region to create the inner line. Guilty Gear uses this squaring method for absolutely everything except complicated details like screws, eyes, and text, which are painted on normally. This is a much harder technique to pull off than painting, and frankly, if your goal is animation, texture fidelity can be about as high as you want. But if you're working on a game and you really care about graphical fidelity up close, you can use this method for those crisp lines along with modeling in detail just like you did on the face. Though tedious, both painting and shading like Guilty Gear are my favorite part of the process, so take your time here and make your character look pretty. It's at this phase that you can really start identifying where issues lie and fixing them with both sculpting and clever painting, so be sure to study those Guilty Gear and Zenless models in the description to get an idea of what you're shooting for. To square a UV like Guilty Gear, we'll either purchase the $20 UV Squares add-on that does this all in one click, or we'll take a square from our island, scale the top and bottom edges by pressing S, Y, 0, then we scale the side edges by pressing S, X, 0, and then we press 3 to enter face select, press L to select our whole island, and select the fixed square so it turns white. Now press F3 and follow active quad. And if you think that's tedious, just try doing it to 100 more islands. Now that you have these though, you can just draw out squares of flat color all over your canvas with black edges in between. To do this, just use any brush, set it to line, and then hold Alt while you're creating your line to straighten it. So long as you're using a hard brush, it'll have a perfectly flat edge even if you're using a round brush. And now just drag your square UVs into the area and then drag the edges outside of the color to create outlines. In the case of my character, I did a bit of a mixed style, with the Guilty Gear outlines on all my clothes, hair, and then a fairly 3D looking painted face and knees. You can see this reflected on my texture map as I have all these nice squares for everything else and then these huge maps just for my face and knees. You can visually see how much texture space these Guilty Gear shaders save just by looking at this. One other thing to note for me is that because the clothes are textured using these squares, these wavy clothing details are impossible unless you create a second UV map, which you unwrap normally and then paint and multiply over the original textures. This is the method Guilty Gear uses for these scuff marks and images on the model, and the Guilty Gear shader I'll cover in a second even has a dedicated slot just for this map. So in my case, I'll be creating this black and white map with my details, connecting up a new UV map and using that for the waves. Once your character is good as it can be, it's time to get procedural. For those of you in the Lupin camp, hooray! You can just skip this, put your model in Substance Painter and follow the regular old texturing workflow and hook it up to a principled BSDF. For those of you in these camps, get ready! If you're looking for a unique vision with maximum control, I'd recommend building your own shader from scratch, and in that case I cannot recommend Goo Engine enough. If you have Goo Engine, Dillongoo already has a fantastic tutorial on creating a Genshin type shader using Goo Engine that you can understand from the inside out and modify to your heart's content. If you don't have Goo Engine though, here's a rundown of everything it can do for you in the shading process, told by none other than Dillongoo.
Hey guys, I'm Dillongoo. Nice to meet you. I'm the one who made Goo Engine. It's crazy. Sunny is online, dragged me here against my will. But so, we created Goo Engine specifically for our animation studio, Dillongoo Studios, for the YouTube channel, Dillongoo. And we do all of our projects in it. It is specifically tailored for the anime style, but it is very, very generalized, so you can still use it for non-anime stuff for sure. Goo Engine allows you to break up the shader's information into what our node is called shader info node. So the shader info node allows you to have a lot more control over the light information and the shadow information, and it also gives you access to light groups. Light groups is not in Blender, at least not for Eevee, and it allows you to actually isolate lights per character or per shader. So each shader can respond to a different light without affecting each other. Not to mention, we also have per node light groups, which allows you to separate out, different parts of the shader to listen to different lights, which is very, very powerful. Because, you can have, one single shader for, maybe the entire body, but you still want the face to be separated. Or maybe you want one light to affect the gradient of a particular character, but one light to affect the shading of the character, right? Things like that. Now you can actually have that kind of control. Whereas before, every single light in the scene would affect the shader, which is useless for NPR users. So you want to really make sure you have that light control. We also have the curvature node. The curvature node is a way you can actually add kind of like these fake bevel highlights that we typically use. This is a really, really common thing in anime environments, especially. You get a couple of extra bevels, you get a beautiful rim light. Both of those things can be added from the curvature node data. Curvature node, very, very powerful. Shader info node, very, very powerful. Light groups, very, very powerful. Those are the three main things that Goo Engine is able to do, on top of a couple of really, really cool things that we also add as quality of life features. I put it somewhere on our website, I think dillongoostudios.com/gooengine or gooengine.org will bring you there. If you guys want to get Goo Engine, it is open source. You can build it yourself on GitHub. It is there. But if you want to support us in the development of Goo Engine, because it is very difficult and does require money, but if you want to support the further development of Goo Engine, you can also donate to our Patreon, so you can get them there as well. Anyway, back to Sunny.
If dragging Dylan into this video wasn't enough to convince you, I personally have used Goo Engine in multiple projects now, and if you want to learn more about using Goo Engine and building your own shaders, Comfy Mug has basically built a career on this. His anime tutorials are absolutely fantastic, and the shader editor is a mighty, mighty tool. That being said, if you build your own shader, it's going to require a lot of knowledge of your tools and a lot of time. If that's not time you have, or you just like the look of these instead, let's talk about the tech that already exists. If you intend to shade your model like Guilty Gear, lucky for you, there are already tons of resources on this. I'll link the Guilty Gear shader in the description. Here's a rundown of how this works. course, if you want to follow along in text, I'm getting this information from the Arcsys Discord's wonderful Google Doc guide. The color input here is your colored texture. Just take the color and alpha from your picture and plug them in here. Next is SSS, or Subshadow Surface. This determines the color of the shadows in any colored areas. The reason we do this is because the shadows are a little more complicated than just a darker color. Usually shadows have a bit of a decrease in visual detail and a higher saturation, so painting them ourselves can do a lot for our look. For the SSS alpha, just plug in a black RGB node. The alpha of the SSS controls the intensity of the taste color, which most models don't even use. Next is ILM. This map requires a little more explaining, as it's part of the shader for Genshin Impact 2. In essence, this map uses the RGB and alpha channels of the image to determine 4 different things. The green channel adds ambient occlusion. Any green value of 0.5 is lit normally, any green value below 0.25 will be in permanent shade, and any value below 0.1 will be in permanent dark shade. And any values above 0.5 will remain lit in all cases and have some highlights. The red channel controls the specular intensity, so in an area with 0 red, there's no specular, and in areas with full red, there is a bright white specular. The blue channel controls the size of the specular and how much it's occluded by shadow. Finally, you can use the alpha channel for any black line art you want. So long as it dips into an area with 0 alpha, you'll get a line. To create your own ILM map, I'd recommend using an image editor. You can individually paint each channel, including the alpha, and then just lay them on top of each other with the screen blending mode to get a finished ILM map. If you want to thug this out in Blender for whatever reason, create an image texture with 0 alpha and then just switch your color wheel to RGB and paint all your color values at once. You also have access to an erase alpha and add alpha brush right up here. Finally, we have the detail. For this, you'll create a map with all the detail and such you want, with the detail in black and then everything else in a 0.5 gray. Create a separate UV map and map all the wonderful little scuff and details you want to this map, and then plug that new map into the image texture and plug that into the detail tab. In the description, I will also have 2 Genshin Impact shaders, which can be set up using a very similar system. One costs $2, which is a little worse than free, but for a standard toon shader with tons of awesome control, this is an incredible resource. Genshin doesn't use the graphical fidelity tricks that Guilty Gear uses, so there are no channels in this shader for detail and such, just a base and shadow color. However, if you're taking any other approach than Guilty Gear, this is easily the way to go, and I'd call it probably the best replacement for a default toon shader you can get. For the most part, it seems like Zenless also uses a Genshin shader, just with the hardness reduced to soften things out. The second shader is Festivity's Genshin shader, which is free but requires Goo Engine. That being said, this shader is robust and nearly one-to-one with Genshin Impact. Despite having now either chosen or created your shader, you'll probably notice that your lighting still looks like a bit of a mess, and luckily we can fix this. In 2D art, there's a concept called shadow shapes. In essence, we form shadows out of clear shapes for a more readable character, and leave out small details that don't matter for a more appealing design. In anime, this often manifests as what we call the Rembrandt triangle. When one side of the face is lit from a specific angle, a small triangle of light appears on the other side of the face, and the nose gains this strong shadow. This is about as complex as anime lighting gets most of the time, with the rest of the shading just being different variations on this sort of jawline tracing shadow. Usually anime faces are lit using some variation of just these 5 angles, so the question is, how do we tell Blender to only place light on these faces? And the answer to that, once again, is nebulous. Genshin and Zenless Zone Zero use something called a light map. In essence, this is a 2D black and white map that determines what parts of the face are lit by what intensity of light, and when mirrored across the face, you can use it as a map that determines where all the light lands. What's cool about this method is that the normals of the face remain intact for future use, and you also don't have to include any insane facial topology to get the mouth looking right. I'll include a link to Notable's tutorial on using this Genshin shader, as his video is full of resources to direct you even further. Light maps are also fantastic because there's absolutely no snapping when you rotate a light around the model, which for a game with a freely moving camera is absolutely essential. The Guilty Gear method is a bit more intentional with where the shadows are placed, but if you're an animator who likes to be intentional with their light and already made this triangle mouth, editing normals isn't too awful of an experience. Vertex Arcade has easily the best tutorial on this, so I advise you go there. These two explain this topic better than I ever could, no point in reinventing the wheel. Once you've found your method of shading, modified your normals, made some beautiful textures in a shader you like, time for something more important to anime, arguably, the outlines. In Blender, we have 3 outline methods. All are somewhat imperfect, but they have upsides worth considering for your project, and can always be mixed and matched. Grease Pencil is Blender's native line art tool, adapted from the freestyle line feature. Look at me using it all the way back in 2012. Oh, where do the years go? This outline is impossible to export to anything other than Blender, so if you plan on doing anything but just rendering in Blender, this option is not worth considering. However, as a Blender animator, there is so much to love. It looks good from literally every angle out of the box. There are controls to make it so your outlines look wobbly and hand-drawn, and you can even set the lines to be drawn inside the model along collarbones and clothing seams. They cover intersecting materials and objects, hide clipping, rarely artifact, and if you find an issue, it's all completely customizable after baking. The biggest downside is that you have very little line weight control unless you're willing to adjust it manually frame by frame, which is where the inverse hull method comes in. The inverse hull method involves duplicating your model and flipping it inside out and then shading that flipped model all black. You see this everywhere, and for good reason. It's exportable to any platform, it gets the job done 99% of the time, and it's very flexible with things like line weight. The only issue is that it doubles the poly count of your character, and it sometimes can be a little hard to work with. And because it technically culls at the character, it's nearly impossible to make these outlines look as hand-drawn as Grease Pencil. That being said, with the power of vertex groups, this outline method supports powerful line weight tools that for some styles like Guilty Gear are absolutely essential. Guilty Gear uses tons of inverse hulls for any outline it can't achieve with texturing, and the tech they use is pretty advanced, but lucky for us, the godfather of basically all Arcsys tech has created a geometry node setup just for this. Contained in the same file as the Guilty Gear shader is the outline geometry node setup. To use it, you'll just apply the nodes to your model, fill in all the blanks, and then you'll use vertex paint to tell your outline what to do. Just like the Arcsys shader, the information about this is also in the document, but luckily it's a little easier to understand here. The alpha channel stores the size of your outline. An alpha of 0.5 will be a regular outline, an alpha of 0 means no outline, and a value of 1 means a big outline. The blue channel is the depth control. The bluer an area is, the further it will be sent back from the camera. This can prevent certain parts like the hair from visually clipping. Finally, the green channel makes it so certain outlines only appear from certain distances, which unless you're using the depth controls shouldn't come into play much. What's cool is that you can combine this method with Grease Pencil so long as they're the same color, and sometimes it can be worth it to use them in conjunction depending on what you're outlining to have the best of both worlds. Nothing is stopping you. Finally, we come to compositing. Since Blender added real-time compositing in Blender 4.0, I figure it's worth figuring out how your character will look before you ship them off to an environment to animate in. That means it's time for bloom. For older vintage anime, a little bit of bloom helps simulate the color that inevitably bleeds into the line work when a frame is photographed, and sometimes vintage anime would intentionally use real light to light up certain scenes. So for emissive objects or these bright backgrounds, crank up your bloom. For that 90s look, a Gaussian blur, film grain, and some light chromatic aberration also help. Modern anime is where things get a bit more dialed back. For the most part, you're just going to see a lot of very digital bloom when things get bright, or just some of those classic JoJo hue shifts. If you want control over looks like this, the compositor has a node called the switch node, which does exactly that, switches on and off whatever is connected to it so you can have these controls on the fly. Other than that, now you're done. You have an anime character built exactly to your vision, and if you want to learn more about environments and animation using your character, Dillongoo has even more resources on this, and was even an original animator on Ruby, which absolutely shows in his work. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me, and of course my singular $9 tier patron, Jules. Thanks for watching everyone, I'll see you next time when I talk about the hidden lore of Foursquare.